Namaste, welcome to Clear Cut with J Sai Deepak. This is a long awaited episode that we were planning to have many months back, but unfortunately the COVID struck again and this got delayed. Immediately after the lockdown ended, we went looking for Sai and we found him hidden under a pile of notes writing something very intently, and we discovered that he's writing a book. So we decided that this episode is going to happen after the book comes out. So the book is not physically available yet, but it's already there on Amazon and you can order it online. The title of the book is India That is Bharat, Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution. Welcome back, Sai.
Namaste.
Would you like to start with an apology to the viewers for becoming a hermit?
So I think it's a break that I needed from all the interactions, and I just needed to go into a bit of a shell because I had to juggle both my professional commitments as well as this writing schedule, and I realized that writing articles, even if it happens to be a weekly column, isn't anywhere remotely the same as writing a book. It calls for a different kind of stamina and patience altogether. So an apology is certainly due, but it's for a good cause, an Indic cause.
Of course. So tell me something. Where do you see the book fitting in with the larger scheme of things? Let's say your personal journey as a thinker, as a lawyer, as a writer, and the larger cause that you're associated with.
Without any attempt at false modesty, which I'm not capable of, let me be candid in saying that I've written this book more from the perspective of a learner. No pretensions of being an intellectual thinker or whatever it is, or any other label that anybody else wants to give me or impute to me. The idea has been to try and make sense of everything that I've been saying all these years, at least for the last 4.5 to 5 years when I've gotten vocal about these Indic issues. And the test of any proposition or any position is when the pen meets the paper. And that's when you more or less understand whether there is a logical consistency in what you say, whether the premises are as well fleshed out as you make them out to be when you speak. Because when you speak, there is a significant degree of theatricality involved in it. People sometimes get lost in the language, the accent, the diction, the eloquence, or whatever they call it. But beyond that, is there enough meat in this entire position is what I wanted to understand. And given that it requires a confluence of certain subjects which I'm not formally trained in or remotely qualified in, so to speak, I had to do a fair bit of reading and then combine it with my, let's say, home turf, which is constitution. So civilization, coloniality, which effectively requires me to look at social sciences, political science, political economy, aspects which you don't get exposed to much in a 3-year law program, and I don't think even in a 5-year integrated law program, from whatever I understand. So the idea was to unlearn and relearn and completely learn a few things.
Right. So I've been following your series of articles for the Daily Guardian, and they seem to be very similar in their theme to the title of the book. So I have not read the book, of course.
Right.
How is it different, or how similar is it to what you've already spoken in those?
Right. So the theme is certainly there is a significant degree of intersectional overlap, but in terms of both structure and the depth of the content and the kind of literature that I've had to deal with and the kind of evidence that I've marshaled to actually take those propositions to their logical conclusion, so to speak, the articles are not a patch on the book, even if I say so myself. So there's no way that anybody who's read the articles can assume that this book is a compilation of those articles. It's much beyond that. Some of the material, in fact about 80 to 85% of the material which is in the book, will not be found in the articles under any circumstances. Because I was very, very conscious of this particular fact when I started writing the articles. The articles were more or less a testing ground to see how the audience warms up to this particular concept, and whether I have what it takes to understand, make sense of it, and also present it in a fairly reasonable fashion, let's say readable and lucid fashion, because I have a word limit of 1500 to 2000 words in those articles. So I don't think based on the articles, anybody can judge the book. And if it's a question of there being a commonality of theme, coloniality as a literature has existed even before. So I was merely introducing it here, but applying it in a very, very specific context, in the context of Bharat, and taking it towards the discussion on constitution is something that this book does. And dare I say this, there is no other book, according to me, in the Indian market which has attempted this particular exercise so far. So this is a very specific niche. Be that as it may, I don't think this is a book that is geared exclusively to a legal audience. There is enough material for history buffs. There is enough material for people who study political science. There is enough material for people who are interested in civilizational studies. And then people who are interested in understanding all of this, what does it translate to in terms of political economy, and then the constitution. So think of it as a telescope. So coloniality is the broadest possible lens, and then you go to civilization, and then you go to constitution. Constitution being the ultimate scope of, let's say, or the ultimate object of attention. But when I say ultimate, it occupies barely about 20 to 25%, because the sequels will do this even better, because it's part of a trilogy. This book effectively lays the conceptual foundations, the historical foundation. So to that extent, I think there's something for everyone in this book.
Right. So tell us something more about the structure of this particular book, maybe the target audience, and what is in store in the subsequent books.
So every time I've delivered a talk on the need to read history, on the need to understand the value of history, I've been asked a lot of questions by a lot of people saying, what books do you suggest we read? Authors, specifically books. I'm sure that there are other people who are better qualified than me when it comes to history. So what I've tried to do here is, for the purposes of my discussion in the book, whatever books I think are go-to from the standpoint of expertise and standard literature, which according to me is must-read literature, all that has been encapsulated. In fact, one of the objects of this book is to revive interest in the literature that was created in the late, let's say, last part of 19th century and the first half of 20th century by Indian scholars, and specifically Indic scholars. What I would call as perhaps the first contemporary Indic Renaissance. So all that literature has been encapsulated, coupled with all the work that has been done subsequently, even in the 90s and 2000s, but which has been marginalized by the post-colonial school and the Marxist school. All that literature I've presented so that people can read and say, why haven't we been taught all of this? It's not as if the literature hasn't existed. Why haven't we come across this? Or why hasn't it achieved the kind of attention that it ought to have? Why haven't we heard of these authors? Why are they maligned as far-right, xenophobic and illiberal and whatnot? After all, it's a legitimate position that they're presenting within a conceptual framework. So that's one. So I'm trying to cater to an audience anywhere upwards of 18, and it can go right until 50. Beginners can also take up the book, and those with a fair degree of understanding can also take up the book. But it's an intersectional audience, which has to necessarily look at three different aspects. So the structure of the book is captured in the subtitle itself, which is Coloniality first, which speaks of the global canvas of European colonization, or the colonization of the world by Europe. The second section of the book deals with civilization, which is the impact of European colonization on Bharat. There is a specific chapter that deals with even Middle Eastern colonialism, and it's stressed with Bharat, or Bharat stressed with Middle Eastern colonialism. And the third part is the constitutional aspect, where I look at the impact of constitutional consciousness, or let's say the impact of colonial consciousness on constitutional consciousness. So what we understand as modern Bharatiya constitutionalism, the so-called transformative constitutionalism, what does it come from? What are its origins? So think of it as the first two sections of the book acting as lenses for the third section of the book.
Okay, so this is a book which is not particularly targeted at lawyers?
Absolutely. I would actually think of it as a failure if it manages to attract attention only in lawyers. It goes much beyond that. Lawyers certainly, but much beyond lawyers. In fact, this book is going to challenge a lot of established notions that lawyers themselves have about the origins of India's constitutionalism and so-called values that they constantly celebrate. I hope it's a revelation to them.
Very interesting. Interesting that you mentioned about your, the sources and the literature survey that you've done. Did you get a feeling, this is slightly off topic, but did you get a feeling that there was much more emphasis on profound scholarship in pre-independence India?
Without a doubt, and as my discussions with Sri Sandeep Balakrishna reveal, the quality of scholarship with respect to Bharat's pre-colonial past and the impact of colonization on Bharat has gone significantly after 1947. That much is very, very clear. As a layperson, relatively speaking, despite this book, I would say that it is absolutely clear that our scholarship in the history departments is abysmal, especially in the political science front, because history without any understanding of political science and political economy has zero context. It's just a mumbo jumbo of facts. You have to give it a narrative. What does it all translate to? It's abysmal. And the stellar scholarship that has otherwise come, despite the establishment and despite resistance from the predominant establishment, has never been mainstreamed. And specifically by that I mean works of Sri Sitaram Goel, Dharampal, Sri Konrad Elst, Jacob de Roover, S.N. Balagangadhara. Their works I've had to go through. And I can even go to the extent of saying that I'm giving a conceptual framework which will more or less encapsulate all their works to a significant extent. I'm not trying to make a totalizing position here. I'm merely saying that I'm giving a common feature that characterizes their work to the extent that they themselves have not used this language, but the idiom, the sentiment and the intention is common between all these scholars, which is to unpeel the Indian consciousness of all the layers of colonial consciousness that it is buried under. So people may have not used this word, or they may have not actively used this framework, but their work was nevertheless geared in the same direction.
Right. So any particular reason that you chose this title, which is partially cliched and partially provocative, I suppose? India, that is Bharat.
Right. So in the aftermath of the CAA and the Delhi riots, when there was a debate that was going on Twitter, I used the word Bharat to represent India. And an Indian engineering student pursuing his masters in America accused me of bigotry for having used Bharat to refer to India. And he said this is completely against the spirit of the Constitution. So I reproduced Article 1 of the Constitution and presented it.
Are we supposed to refer to the Constitution while speaking?
That seems to be the case, but even if we are supposed to refer to the Constitution, my point is the Constitution itself says India, that is Bharat. So I wanted to reproduce Article 1, and the moment I did that, the gentleman blocked me and he vanished. He deleted his tweet. The point was the utter corruption in the minds of this particular age bracket with respect to what is bigotry, what is secularism was, I mean, I'm sorry, it is, I'm shocked at the kind of misinformation that passes off as information and knowledge. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to capture it very, very clearly, saying, in fact, this was one of the titles of one of the pieces of my Sunday Guardian column. So I said, why not make this the centerpiece itself, so that people understand that the Constitution refers to Bharat, and therefore there's a significance to it.
This anecdote actually reminds me of something similar which I recently observed. There was a tweet by someone, again from someone in America, an Indian American, who took issue with the use of Om Shanti for...
I see, people passing.
Yeah. So he's like, this is a new kind of bigotry which is...
Oh, so all of us are supposed to subscribe to rest in peace, is it? We won't let the person rest in peace.
So yeah, so now coming specifically to the the subtitle, which is coloniality, right?
Right.
And I've noticed that you've been trying to popularize this. This is a very academic term,
right?
And you've popularized this to a significant extent on social media.
Right.
What is coloniality, and what are its implications in very simple terms?
So, colonization, coloniality, and colonialism. The relationship between the three is very, very important for us to understand. So, coloniality is perhaps the most intangible aspect of colonization. To put it in very simple language, this is the soch or the mansikta or the dharana behind it. So, colonization itself is typically seen as the cause, but it is merely a manifestation of a certain thought, of a certain cause in itself. What is the beta cause underlying it? So, why does colonization start? What is it informed by? What are its inspirations? Does it have a religious inspiration or a racial inspiration? Does the racial inspiration have a religious inspiration? These are aspects that coloniality unpacks. So, coloniality is the software and colonization is the hardware. So, the idea is to understand what drives this machine, what drives this policy of colonialism. So, coloniality, according to me, is the soft element, which is to say, it is the actual thought that drives this entire project, this globalization, colonization, westernization, Europeanization project. So that is why it becomes very, very important, because as you know, an intangible, the strongest quality or the feature of an intangible is its all pervasiveness. It moves like water. Okay, so even if you remove the hard infrastructure, the soft component stays. So the question is, after decolonization, has the soft component remained in this country? Has the thought remained in this country, which translates to this creature that all of us know as the Brown Sahib? How does the Brown Sahib continue to be in this country after the actual Angrez has left? Therefore, there is some intangible component that continues to survive even after the white man, the European, has left this country. That is why it's very important to understand the thought behind the actual process.
So decolonizing the mind is essentially
decoloniality.
Right. Okay. So your premise in this book, is it that India is a civilizational state already, and we just need to do a little bit of tinkering here and there and make it apparently so, or does it need to transition into one and a lot of work needs to be done in that?
So without revealing too much until the book is out, I'll keep it very simple, just to address the point that a state which presides over a civilization doesn't automatically become a civilization state. समाज एक संस्कृति या एक civilization हो सकता है, but क्या राष्ट्र या राज्य, is it based on that particular concept? Has it behaved in such a manner? Has it arranged itself in such a manner? That is a question that I've tried to address. Interestingly, this question was addressed in 19th century, or let's say mid 20th century, by the scholars then, because this was the precise argument that they were trying to make. So it is my belief that a civilizational state and a state which presides over a civilization are not the same. So therefore, this straightforward extrapolation that most people tend to rely upon to say that if it happens to be a civilization and there is a state, then it's a civilization state, I'm sorry, that's too simplistic an approach which has no basis either in logic or the subject itself, because civilizational studies aise nahi hote. Okay, you don't throw around the word civilization state like a buzzword, like a talking point. It has a lot more elements to it, because the basic question is that when a state decides to form its policies, does it do so with the conscious knowledge that it's a civilizational state? So what does it translate to? Preserving that particular character. Then आपके language policies कैसे होते हैं, आपके religion के policies कैसे होते हैं, religion को आप कैसे define करते हैं, कितने सारे thought processes को आप religion का दर्जा देने के लिए तैयार हैं. These are the basic issues that the state has to look into. I have unpacked all of this, but to answer your question, let us not confuse a civilizational state with a state that presides over a civilization. Whether Bharat is one or not is something that I have addressed in the book.
Right. But addressing a basic question like, why civilization state? What is wrong with India today?
Because you see, there is a nationalizing tendency, and the nationalizing tendency typically translates to a monochromatizing tendency to try and fit everything. And I'm not trying to include, let's say, the discussion with respect to religious minorities here. I'm not keeping them a part of this particular discussion. I'm addressing this question primarily from a dharmic perspective, from an Indic perspective, which is to say, when we realize that the Indic society's primary characteristic is diversity, then is the state alive to it? Does it respect it? What does it do to keep that particular part of the identity alive? Or does it have a homogenizing tendency? And if there is a homogenizing tendency, does it come from its experience with colonialism and coloniality? In which case, is its thought process infected by coloniality, which results in thinking of Bharat as a nation? Okay, so these are certain aspects which are important for us to understand, because it addresses multiple issues, from uniform civil code to, let's say, development related issues, to what is our language policy, how do we choose to impart education with respect to history in different parts of the country, because while there may be a certain national history, there are several regional histories. So how do we want to address that? That is where I think the civilization aspect comes in heavily. Education.
Right. So you mentioned in the beginning of the of our conversation that you have referred to a variety of sources, and it's very eclectic, your research in that context. So while tackling this issue, right, of coloniality, of civilization and the constitution, what are the sources that you have fallen back on, other than the ones that you mentioned, the Indian scholars that we all know of?
So the repository of literature and scholarship that is produced with respect to decoloniality, which has its origins in Latin America. So starting from 1989, so Latin America, North America, Caribbean, Africa, their literature primarily, because those scholars have interacted among themselves. This scholarship and the school of thought is effectively a product of their cogitations and deliberation. Then I've moved from there to development studies. Scholars like Arturo Escobar, what has he said with respect to development, especially in a post-colonial world? After colonization, how has the language changed? How does aid of donor countries affect the civilization and economics and cultural aspects of colonized countries, former colonies, which are now recipient countries? Then I've dealt with the scholarship of the University of Ghent, led by Dr. S. N. Balagangadhara. Heavily I've cited them, followed by constitutional work starting from the mid 20th century, that is before Bharat's constitution came into existence. Books produced by both British lawyers as well as Indian lawyers and Indian judges with respect to movement towards constitutionalism, which captures the entire political-legal evolution of the European infrastructure in Bharat, starting from the laws they passed, how did it gradually move to legislative councils, how did it lead to representative councils, whether each of these decisions are purely secular in nature, because we typically understand that anything that has to do with administration is purely secular in nature. Whereas, is there a political theology at work behind each of these, let's say, aspects which are established in Bharat and in other countries? So I've tried to compare as many jurisdictions as possible to say, if something has happened outside and the dramatis personae remain the same, their thought processes remain the same, why do we assume that it's been different as far as Bharat is concerned? Why would his intentions have changed in Bharat? The only way his intentions could have changed is because you resisted and you fought back. There couldn't have been any other reason. So these are the issues that I touch upon, and this is the kind of literature that I've actually dealt with.
Right. So, I mean, I was about to ask that in your literature survey, given that you've referred to scholars from Latin America and places where the native culture has been extinguished.
Completely.
So, does that play a major role in the fact that the scholarship has been more vibrant on the...
In fact, this is one aspect that I've addressed interestingly in the initial introductory chapters, which is to say, once your religious identity has been completely wiped out and you've become Christian, which is what has happened in all these jurisdictions, your only filter remains the racial filter. That's the only window through which you look at your past. Okay, and that seems to be acceptable. But as long as you keep your religion alive and you look at the atrocities committed on you, then you don't get the status of a victim. So there are markers of, and there is a benchmark of who can be a victim that will also be decided by the West. So you must lose everything. You should come to a point where you're able to cry, "Main lut gayi, barbaad ho gayi," and then you have to say, yes, he is a victim. So someone who's managed to retain his or her religious identity and still is in a position to say, this is what you've done to us, is not given the status of a victim. That is one of the things that I try and touch upon to basically say, their entire focus seems to be race because religion is no more possible. They've lost it. Less than 10% or let's say 5% of the population is now native or indigenous, either in North America or Latin America. And when you're dealing with an organized religion and organized entity, so to speak, how can you hope to get it back? Right? So the struggles they go through, which limits the scope of the discussion, the freedom that we have to actually expand the scope of the discussion, and still we don't do it because there are filters in our head.
Correct.
Notwithstanding the fact that there is a religious democracy that is still in your favor to some extent, there is a religious identity that is still alive, you don't wish to acknowledge the religious aspects of colonization, which clearly shows that there is a filter that blocks you from acknowledging it and from admitting it and examining it. So that's precisely the proof of this entity called coloniality, which clearly shows that something is preventing you from accessing that part of your past, because there is this politically correct filter in your head. If I say this, I will be branded unsecular or anti-secular or a bigot. These are the aspects that I try to unpack with as much literature as possible, citing their own literature.
Right. So as long as it is a culture is not in a museum,
correct,
it suffers from. So it's a profound paradox actually.
Exactly. That means you imagine the fact that the colonizer will now decide, are you a victim or not? Right. His successor, the Westerner, will now decide whether you are a victim or not. and he will get to decide. जब तक आप museum में push नहीं कर दिए गए and you're not on the verge of extinction, you're not given the status of a colonizer. That means, let's say a victim. What does it show? So it is not just a question of attributing or giving you the status of a victim. Until then, he will not admit his own guilt.
Right.
And his role in it. Until you're dead. That's the point.
So tell me something. Have you discussed these issues with other people from your fraternity, seniors, or other scholars, and what has been their response?
So, given my lack of training in the humanities department and a professional qualification in it, I did not want to be entirely an autodidact. I didn't see the point in learning everything on my own because I'd be reinventing the wheel. So I decided to reach out to a few people, but before that, the first person who pushed me in the direction of the decoloniality literature is Dr. Indu Vishwanathan. And one of the reasons that she did that was because she was of the opinion that the work that I was doing and others were doing already, according to her, fell within the realm of decoloniality in action. So she said, you're anyway doing it, you're anyway practicing it in cases like Sabarimala and other places. So why don't you actually take a look at the literature, take a look at the conceptual framework, and I'm sure it's going to help your work even better. So she actively pushed me in the direction, shared the literature, introduced me to other scholars. So in fact, during the course of the writing of the first section of the book on coloniality, I held extensive discussions with her to understand if I was getting it right. I didn't want to seem like a new convert who was getting overzealous about the concept. I wanted to be fairly balanced about it, its realistic possibilities in terms of its applications, considerations of pragmatism and other things. Second, after the book was done, I was fairly skeptical about the reception it would get from the academic fraternity, because that's a fraternity that I'm certainly trying to reach out to. So I took a chance and I sent it to the leading scholars of the subject in universities across the world, including Bharat. The idea was not to go after savvy names in the public domain, but actual names which have done work in this particular area, historians, academics, scholars, researchers, and ask their honest opinion. So I'm happy to say, and this is without any iota or smidgen of immodesty, that I'm relieved to know that my work doesn't sound foolish to them. And in fact, I've received fairly positive endorsements and endorsements which go to the extent of asking me to continue working in this particular direction from the pioneers of this particular subject.
Wow.
Who have taken the time out to go through the entire manuscript. When I asked them for blurbs, they ended up sending me something that runs into 700 to 800 words, proper reviews, and they've been fairly encouraging and gives me the confidence that I'm certainly on the right track and that I can read out this particular work in public domain before an audience of scholars without cutting a sorry figure or without coming across as a fool, because it's important that it's not just sufficient to reach out to a certain audience. The place where people actually work on this, if they don't respect you and your work, what is the point? That's the actual test. So I'm happy to inform your viewers that the work has received endorsement from the best of minds, from people who know what they're talking about, and people who do this for a living on a daily basis. So to that extent, I think the project has received the kind of validation that it is supposed to from the core academic audience.
Excellent, excellent. And has this, maybe it's too early to ask, but I'll still do that. Has this changed the way in which you do your legal practice?
I now know how to perhaps represent my cases on civilizational issues,
Right.
giving it a much more rigorous conceptual basis and going beyond the realm of the law and bringing it within the realm of the law. So to be able to connect political science, political economy, humanities with constitutionalism and how they're supposed to enmesh, now I think I have a fair idea of how to go about doing it.
But if I reframe this question and say, if you were to go back to time travel and go back to the Sabarimala case,
Right.
would you argue any differently, or would this have helped?
So it would have certainly helped. The core argument would remain the same. because the core argument is precisely what actually attracted attention in the first place from scholars of this particular area. So what I would have certainly done is to build a proper edifice around it, right, and presented a different superstructure, still presenting the same core argument. And I think one of the validations that I received from my own fraternity is a well-known senior advocate of the Supreme Court, who has been a constant source of encouragement during this entire process, because he's believed that I should actually undertake this kind of a project for a very long time, who is now happy that there is a master template of sorts which can be used for civilizational issues which are pending before the court and potential civilizational issues.
Very nice. So when do you start working on the next book, part in the series?
I'm taking a Kit Kat break. So, because this has taken a lot of my time, and I've had to juggle my professional responsibilities as an arguing counsel. And the thing is, during the course of the lockdown, because of virtual hearings, I've had the benefit of appearing across several high courts in the country. So the work has actually increased. So during that period is when I've actually written the book. But the second and the third book, which is part of the trilogy, the Bharat trilogy, would be relatively easier because the theory is done.
Right.
The conceptual foundations are done. That edifice has been completely laid out for the most part. Now the idea is to extrapolate it to the history of the framing of the Constitution and beyond, which is what it's all about. So to give you an idea, this book covers the period between 1492, when Columbus's expedition began, to 1919, when the first Government of India Act came out, which is the first British-made constitution for Bharat. And it ends when the League of Nations was founded, and then of course, as a consequence of the Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Versailles after the end of the First World War. It covers the period until 1919-1920. The second book will cover the period from 1920 to 1951, which is where you have the meat of the framing of the Constitution. And 1951, because that was the time you had the first amendment to the Constitution, where free speech was restricted by Sri Jawaharlal Nehru, ably assisted by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Then the second sequel, which is the third part of the trilogy, will deal with the period from 1952 to at least 1977, but I have a clear picture of taking it beyond that particular time frame. But the idea is to cover at least till 1977 because of Srimati or Shri, I don't know, Indira Gandhi regime, where secularism was introduced as part of the preamble, socialism was introduced. So these are certain aspects. So this is effectively the timeline that the book covers, or the trilogy covers.
So in any case, you'll have to, for this first book, you'll have to do your fair bit of running around.
Correct. So I expect to start the second book, I think perhaps at the end of the year.
Right. And part of the running around would also involve coming to our office and signing the copies.
Absolutely, sure, done.
Yeah, so just to inform the viewers that we have pre-ordered a bunch of the books, and they'll be here in August, and we will be offering signed copies. So those of you who are interested can get in touch with us. Great, Sai. I wish you all the best for the next books, and as well as the upcoming book. And I am certainly looking forward to reading it, especially after this interview. Even though we've had some conversations about it in the past, but this was really insightful. Thank you again, and hope to have another session very soon before you turn into a hermit again.
So thanks to you and especially your team here at Pragyata, because I would like to inform the viewers that Team Pragyata has helped me conceptualize the cover design. I've had some fantastic support from Ashish, his colleagues Utkarsh Khanna and Harshit Jadwani, who have worked long hours and have constantly interacted with me for the conception of the cover design, as well as with the designer of the publisher Bloomsbury. So thanks to all your efforts, and the thumping validation that the cover has received from across jurisdictions, with people appreciating it, is a validation of your work and the work of the publisher's designer. So kudos to you.
It was a pleasure.